The bishop's opening is something that most of your opponents have never even heard of, and it's exactly why it works so well. Let me show you how it can lead to deadly attacks and quick wins. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and let's go ahead and get started. Your opponents will usually here develop their pieces one way or the other, but it doesn't really matter because your attacking plan remains to be the same. So let's say they play these common moves, they play knight f6 attacking the pawn, so you defend it, then they develop their bishop similar to the Italian game, and you play knight to c3, one of my favorite systems. It is called Vienna hybrid because it's sort of a hybrid between the Vienna Gambit and the bishop's opening. Here, you're waiting for your opponent's next move to decide how to continue your attack. Mainly you have two ideas, either to play bishop g5 pinning this knight, or to push the f-pawn forward and attack that way, kind of similar to the King's Gambit or the Vienna Gambit. Now, if they castle, because very often your opponents will follow the ancient Sun Tzu quote, I don't know, I'm just gonna castle, and they do that, then bishop g5 becomes more effective. Since your opponent has castled, it is harder for them to start playing h6 and maybe g5 trying to kick this bishop out. Moreover, here you could just retreat your bishop to h4 with a great position, but very often it's even stronger to just play h4 using the fishing pole trap, basically baiting them to capture this bishop, which is not good for them, and we'll see why in a second. By the way, if they don't capture the bishop, you still continue exploiting this pin on the knight. You can bring your queen out and reinforce the pressure, maybe bring the knight out. Therefore, it's still certainly very hard for black to cope with this whole pressure. Now, in most cases, they're simply going to capture the bishop, which is basically a losing mistake. You're going to recapture, attacking this knight, but more importantly, opening this file for your rook. And you can see why it is so effective after your opponent has castled, because now this rook actually starts creating deadly checkmating threats. Also, notice that we delayed development of this knight. Your knight is still right here, not on f3, because otherwise it would block out the queen, and we didn't want that. All right, so the knight now needs to go somewhere. Your queen controls these squares, your pawns control these squares, therefore the knight will have to go somewhere back. And if it goes here or here, it doesn't really matter. You just throw your queen forward to h5, and that is it. You have this battery, you're threatening to capture this knight right on the next turn, so your queen wants to enter one of these two squares and checkmate black. If they try to escape, playing rook e8 and trying to escape that way, then you just first capture this pawn on f7. Notice our bishop from the bishop's opening. It really plays a key role. This way we cut off the king. It can't run away anymore. It has to go here, and now you sacrifice the rook right here and finish the game in style. What if your opponent doesn't castle? Well, then he's likely to play pawn to d6, and then you switch over to your second attacking plan, pawn f4. You're playing somewhat the improved version of the King's Gambit, where you have all the benefits of your kingside attack with no downside, because in this case, this is not even a gambit, your pawn is protected. And from here, also notice that we delayed development of our knight so that the knight does not block the pawn, right? Let me take this back. If you had your knight right here, you wouldn't be able to push the pawn. But because you delayed it, now you have the opportunity to push the pawn forward and only later to develop your knight, reinforcing the pressure to the central pawn. So next you're going to decide what to do after that. Either to keep attacking this pawn on e5, or maybe to push the pawn forward to f5 and really lock the position, gain that space advantage. Now, in both cases, that's pretty unpleasant for your opponent. Now, of course, the question you may have is, hey, how about just capturing this pawn by black? Well, that's good for you. They give up their center, they also help you to develop your bishop, and black gets nothing in return. That's just great. Now, very often, black will play knight to g4 at this point, because when they're playing black, it always seems that the grass is wider on the other side. And plus, bear in mind that you know that you play this secret opening weapon, but your opponent thinks that you're just doing something weird. You don't develop your kingside knight, you don't castle, right? So they think that you're doing something wrong and they want to punish you. And after knight g4, it looks like you're indeed in trouble, because they're going to either play bishop f2, attack your king, or maybe knight to f2 and fork your queen and rook. There's no way for you actually to defend this square, and it looks like you're in trouble. However, you say, I eat challenges for breakfast, and you play pawn f5, kind of encouraging them to execute their threat, because now you lock this bishop from c8, it no longer guards the knight because of your pawn, and therefore queen takes g4 actually is a threat. However, your opponent, of course, is happy. They were going to play knight f2 anyways. With this fork, they're thinking that they're attacking, but little do they know. In fact, they're on a highway to Blunderville, because from here, your queen goes forward to h5, threatening sort of scholar's checkmate, and all of a sudden, your opponent is actually done. The thing is, your attack just develops so quickly, thanks to your space advantage and a lot of pieces that you have there. Usually they will castle, then you play bishop g5, throwing one more piece into the attack with a tempo. This time you're hitting the queen. Notice that they can't move the pawn forward because it's pinned down to the king, again thanks to our bishop from the bishop's opening. Therefore, they need to do something about that. They're going to move the king somewhere. In most cases, they're going to move it to e8, and then you play knight to d5. Again, you ignore this threat, and you create your own counter threats, and you simply outnumber them. Because after whatever your opponent does, let's say they capture this rook or anything else, notice that you've got your queen into the attack, 2 bishops, also this knight, and even the pawn from f5 is also supporting your attack. And now you also have a little funny trick. Your opponent was thinking that you were going to capture this pawn, and that's why you moved the knight to d5. But in fact, you have something else in mind. You're going to sacrifice the knight right here, checking the king. They have to take it, because otherwise queen takes h7 is also coming. But if they take it, then after bishop takes f6, now this king is lonely and exposed, and you're going to checkmate it after something like bishop takes g1 or any other move of black. By the way, it's pretty clear that your opponent skipped the class about the importance of centralization, and so you play queen g5 and just finish the game. Alright, so far we learned one attacking plan that works against pretty much any moves of your opponent. But if your opponent plays here knight f6 in particular, attacking this pawn, then you have also the second choice, which is called the Ponziani Gambit pawn d4. It is even more aggressive. You start challenging your opponent right out of the gate. And there's a very interesting thing here. Now, if you look at the position, there are 2 obvious choices for black. They can either take this pawn on e4, which they attack with their previous move knight to f6, or they can take this one. Now, how do you think which move is correct? And the irony of the situation is that one of these 2 moves is correct. The other one is a losing error. But if your opponent has missed the latest brain update, it's not easy to figure out at all. So let's start with knight takes e4, and this one is a losing error. Because after pawn takes e5, it's very hard for this knight to get out. They'll usually follow up with one more blunder, even though their position is already tough, but they don't know it yet. They play bishop c5, still thinking that they're attacking this pawn on f2, and now you have a choice of how you wish to win the game. One of the ways is to sacrifice your bishop right here on f7, and then follow up with queen to d5. This double attack, you get the knight back on the next turn, and you got this pawn on f7, you expose their king, and you end up with a winning position. However, if there's a choice, I always recommend sacrificing your opponent's pieces instead. So you go queen d5. This way you threaten, queen takes f7, checkmate, plus you attack this knight on e4. And they have nothing to do. Also, if the knight is gone, you're attacking this bishop on c5. So this is sort of a triple attack even. And they can take this pawn on f2, but it's not going to help. And by the way, I can't help but to show you the stats here. Here's the Lichess database of online blitz games, and you can see the top most played move right here at the top. We're going to follow the most played variation so that you can see that this stuff is real. Now, they're usually going to take this pawn with a check to your king, but that doesn't change the situation. You just get the king out, and they're still left with the very same problem. They're going to castle, again, most played move, queen takes e4, now you're up a knight, and you keep attacking. Also, this bishop on f2 is under the attack. They usually retreat back to b6, then you develop your knight. And they play pawn to c6 for whatever reason, guess they're preparing pawn to d5. But now you can play bishop d3, threatening this one. Notice that not only you're up a piece, you're the one attacking. They play g6 because they have to, otherwise there's checkmate. Now you play bishop g5, throwing your bishop into the attack and attacking the queen. Now they move the queen somewhere, the most played to e8, then bishop f6, you're locking the king, getting ready to throw your queen somewhere there. The most played move by black is pawn d5, attacking your queen, but that actually helps you because you were going to play there anyway, still threatening something like this. And as they try to block it with pawn to h5, you have a really beautiful finish. You sacrifice your queen right here on h5, and then you play knight to g5. And even though they're up a queen, it is their turn, they know what you're going to do on the next move, but they have no way to stop it. Now let's talk about the right reaction for black capturing the pawn on d4. Then you don't recapture straight away, but you just develop your knight and you keep it flexible. Then you can decide what to do next. Maybe to play e5 and attack their knight right here, or maybe to recapture this pawn one way or the other. At this point, your opponent will notice that this pawn on e4 is actually undefended, and they'll think, hey, why don't I just go ahead and capture it? Now, of course, your opponent can play something else. They can develop their bishop, their knight, or play any other move. I can't show you all the variations, chess is endless. I actually have my free masterclass where I teach you exactly how to find right moves on your own, even if you don't remember opening variations, because of course you won't. It's impossible to remember this whole thing. So if you're interested, you can click the link below the video and check this out so that you have this more general understanding. Now back to the video, knight takes e4 is the most played move and also very natural. But now you recapture on d4 with a tempo, which is cool. Now the knight will usually retreat back somewhere, either here or here. Now, if they go here, then they're trying to gain a tempo attacking your bishop, but you ignore it. You just castle. And after they capture it, you don't recapture still. Instead, you play rook e1. You just prioritize quick development and attack. They have to cover their king, but now this pawn on g7 is no longer defended by the bishop, therefore you can snatch it and hit the rook. It feels that the rook is safe right here on f8, but after bishop h8, strangely enough, they cannot actually defend it. And if they play some move like this, then you can actually take this because the bishop is pinned, and this happens to be a checkmate. Retreating the knight back to f6 is a more natural move, but now you play bishop g5, still pinning the knight, putting more pressure, and they'll usually play bishop e7 to defend, and then you play knight c3. In this case, you're going to castle queenside, because not only that will put your king to safety, but also will put your rook to this active position. If they go knight c6 to attack the queen, that's not a problem, because the queen slides over here to the king side, and it's going to support your attack down the line. Now, the fun fact is, if they play h6 here, that's not even an attacking move, because the pawn is still pinned down to the rook. You can safely ignore it and just castle. Now, they'll usually castle instead, and you do the same, but you castle queenside so that your rook is also active right here. And yes, you're down a pawn, but you have strong pressure. Across these diagonals, you're ready to bring the other rook into play as well, and you just can see how strong your attack already is. Moreover, on the next move, after d6 or any other move of black, you can play bishop d3 and threaten checkmate straight away. Now, the pawn is currently guarded by the knight, but you can take it, and then play queen takes h7, checkmate. Therefore, they need to do something. And if they play h6, then you just sacrifice your bishop right here to expose their king completely, and now they're pretty much done. There is no defense anymore. After whatever move black, let's say they go bishop g4 trying to pin this knight or any other move, you can play knight g5 just to bring one more piece into the attack. You can't play queen h7 straight away because there is their knight right there, so you need more pieces. And then after they capture or any other move, then you've got bishop takes, bishop to h7, one idea, or the other idea, just knight to d5, deflect this knight or trade it off, and then in whatever case, you've got this checkmate. Finally, there is the so-called Boi Variation where they mimic your moves, but we're gonna punish these copycats by a crazy cat approach. You're gonna still play pawn d4, sacrificing this pawn because you're a generous person. Now, once again, they're at the crossroad. They can take it with a bishop or with a pawn. One of these moves is fine, the other one is losing the game. But as always, it's not easy to figure it out. Now, if they take it by the pawn, that is a losing mistake because of bishop takes f7. Still the same sacrifice, but the follow-up is slightly different. Previously, we talked about the idea of queen coming to d5 with a check and this double attack. Now, you can't jump over the pawn, but you can do it from here with a similar purpose to double attack the king and the bishop. And now after g6 and queen takes c5, you get your bishop back, but along the way you expose the king. Now it's totally vulnerable to your future attacks. Also, you're attacking this pawn on d4. Now, if they try to defend it, then you bring the knight into play and attack it once more. Naturally, they wish to play d6, the most natural move to play, attacking your queen, hoping for it to come back, but you come forward with queen to d5 check. If the king moves, you can snatch this pawn on d4, and you will also be up a pawn in addition to all the other benefits of your position, but they'll usually continue writing their novel, 50 Shades of Blunders, going bishop to e6, hoping that it's a great move, kicking your queen away, but in reality you've got this winning counter knight to g5. This checks the king and also double attacks the bishop. And it's not just the bishop, there is also no normal way for them even to defend here. If they go here, then there is knight takes e6 coming with this double attack, so you're winning the queen. And if they come here, for example, then after queen takes, you actually finish the game with a checkmate. Even if your opponent finds the correct move bishop takes d4, his life is not going to be simple even after that. You play knight f3, hitting this bishop twice. The bishop cannot move away because it also has to guard this pawn on e5. So they play knight c6 to protect the bishop that way. But then after the trade, you continue with bishop e3, and then you gain one more tempo hitting this knight. And as the knight goes back, you then have another tricky move, queen g4. This hits this pawn on g7, and even though your opponent has a number of ways to defend it, they all have certain downsides. If they move the king, then the king will get stuck there and they can't castle after that. Playing g6 just weakens all these dark squares, and they're going to castle there in the future, and is going to be a permanent weakness. In most cases, they continue with queen to f6 to avoid those weaknesses, but then you play knight c3, threatening to jump forward with these double attacks. At this point, something interesting is gonna happen, because good things come to those who bait. Your opponent, after some thinking, will find the move pawn d5. And he'll think that it is a brilliant idea because it attacks your queen and also it's an attack of your bishop. However, no, it's just a blunder. The thing is, after you retreated your queen and they capture your bishop, they are thinking that they're winning, but after knight to d5, you just overload them with all these attacks and they're actually going down. Now you attack the queen. Also this pawn on z7, and it's not just a pawn, because from there, if you capture it, it's going to check their king and attack this rook in the corner. It's going to be a fork. And if they try to guard both of these weaknesses, then they have to move the queen somewhere there, but then they no longer guard the pawn on g7. And you can grab this pawn, and then on the next turn, the rook from there is going to also attack the knight, the king. You can castle queenside to put your rook here opposite their queen, and it's just totally devastating for black. Throughout all these variations, you can see how important it is in chess to not blunder. And if you want to blunder less, check out this video that covers 3 rules that Bobby Fischer used to blunder less and to play consistently well.